No wonder that a popular drink like tea has a rich history dating back to ancient times. Indeed, today, tea takes the second place in the world after water, and it is difficult to find such a corner on earth where this drink would not be loved. Yes, in different regions, people may prefer different varieties of tea, use all kinds of recipes for tea brewing that are fundamentally different from each other. But one way or another, almost everyone drinks tea. However, it was not always the case. There were times when people did not even know about this tiny drink. Since the discovery of tea to present day, it has come a long and sometimes a difficult path. And today, I will try to tell you the whole history of tea, from ancient times to modern era. The birthplace of tea is rightfully considered to be southwestern China and the geographically adjacent regions, Burma and North Vietnam. Wild varieties of tea bush grew and grow here. According to Chinese mythology, the discovery of tea is assigned to Chinese emperor and the father of Chinese medicine, Shen Nong, who lived in China around 2700 BC. He had extensive knowledge in the field of medicine and herbal drugs. There is an opinion that the history of tea began at the moment when Shen Nong, tired from work, decided to boil water on a fire and did not notice how the leaves from the tree fell into it. After drinking the brewed drink, he felt cheerful and full of energy. Warmth spread throughout his body. Then he realized that he had found a new remedy and decided to better study its properties. After this discovery, the Chinese began to actively study tea plants and grow them. A little later, in China, the word tea got its own hieroglyph, which is made in the form of a tree with flowers, leaves, and a person between them. It symbolizes the harmony of man with nature. But this character was pronounced differently in different regions of China, hence the difference in the name of the drink nowadays. In Russia and other countries in the north, the name of the drink chai came from the northern Chinese cha, and it came through a group of Turkic languages. But in Europe, tea appeared from the southern Chinese pronunciation, tea. This explains the difference in pronunciation of the name of the drink. The earliest manuscripts with references to tea survive dated 1115 BC, in which the Chinese prince Zhou Gong had described tea. He noted that after drinking this bitter-tasting drink, a person begins to think better, wants to sleep less, and the body becomes lighter. During the era of Zhou dynasty, the Chinese drank wine, beverages, and brews, among which was tea. Back in the days, people used tea as a medicine. A little later, in the Han era, tea becomes a common item in the Chinese market, especially in modern Sichuan. It becomes popular among all social groups. During the Tang Dynasty, the tea industry developed rapidly with new technologies for growing and processing tea leaves. Tea has become an integral element of Chinese culture. It was sung in songs and poems, depicted in paintings and drawings, and around this period, tea started to be recognized outside of China. The Buddhist monk Tengo Daishi brought knowledge of tea to Japan. At the beginning of the 9th century, he studied in China, and when he returned to Japan, he took tea tree seeds with him. So tea spread in the monastic environment. The monks used it during long meditations in order to cheer up and refresh. But in the 13th century, tea gained popularity outside the monasteries as well. The Japanese began their own research and developed a national tea ceremony, unlike the Chinese tea drinking. In China, the focus is on enjoying the taste and aroma of the drink, and in Japan, on the ritual of the ceremony itself. Black tea was the first to come from China to India, which the Indians studied and tried to grow. But the Indians lacked the knowledge of how to efficiently collect, store, and transport tea leaves until a Dutch company joined the tea business in India in 1728 and decided to grow tea on Indian land. The company hired many Chinese artisans to grow tea according to the Chinese model, which made it possible to obtain tea of the original Chinese quality. Then, in 1833, the British East Indian Company came to India to grow tea. At first, they grew Chinese tea plants, but then they realized that it was more convenient and profitable to cultivate Assam tea, which was better adapted to Indian soil. As early as 1839, Assamese tea was being sold in London. Over time, the British mechanized the process of growing and processing tea, equipping Indian plantations with their technological equipment. This allowed the British to obtain a quality product in large quantities, so India became the land for growing tea for all the countries of Europe. In general, the Portuguese, Dutch, and English began to carry tea from China to Europe at the beginning of the 17th century. Initially, the tea became known as medicinal drink, but eventually, after decades, it started to be consumed for pleasure. The Chinese in those days considered Europeans to be barbarians and were happy to sell them black teas, which they themselves considered low-grade garbage, and kept the best high-mountain green teas for themselves. Therefore, in Europe, they drank mostly black tea. Moreover, it was cheaper and much more difficult to fake. The French learned about tea from the Dutch in 1636. One of the first tea drinkers was King Louis XV. He learned that the Chinese and Japanese, thanks to tea, did not suffer from gout and ordered to treat him this way too. In England, tea was imported by the English East India Company. In 1662, the English king, Charles II, married the Portuguese princess Catherine, who was a raptured tea lover, and introduced tea drinking and set it up as a custom into the court, which of course had a positive effect on income of tea merchants and was also considered as a victory over alcohol, which the lords and ladies drank morning, afternoon, and evening. In mainland Europe and Scandinavia, tea could not take a leading position. These countries remained predominantly coffee. But in England, tea became a national drink. The import of tea increased every year. If in 1690 no more than 10 tons were imported, then in 1790 it was already more than 4,000 tons of tea. Due to the growing demand and complications in trade with China, the British began to develop tea productions in the Indian and then in the Ceylon colonies. Such famous varieties of tea as Assam and Darjeeling originate specifically from India. Attempts were also made to grow tea in Africa, some of which was successful and led to the emergence of African, primarily Kenyan tea. By 1887, the amount of tea from colonies exceeded purchases from China. The issue of the pace of tea transportation became urgent, and they began to transport it by the sea on the so-called tea clippers, the most advanced and fastest ships of their time, among which races were often arranged with a mandatory prize at the end of the competition. There is a known case at such tea races when 3 clippers traveled more than 25,000 kilometers and at the same time entered the harbor side by side. After the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the delivery time was sharply reduced. Consequently, its cost fell. Tea became cheaper, sales volumes doubled in 15 years. Tea came to America in 1690. Initially, it was sold in Boston. At that time, Britain wanted to monopolize the tea market in America and issued the Tea Act, which allowed only the British East India Company to sell tea in the 13 American colonies at an understated price, while the goods of other companies were heavily imposed a tax on. This was supposed to improve the financial condition of the East India Company. For Americans, the Tea Act became a symbol of British tyranny. On December 16, 1773, Americans couldn't stand it any longer, and as a protest, they boarded the ship of the British East India Company and poured all the tea overboard. In response to the protests, Britain passed a law banning the sale of tea in Boston until the value of all discarded tea was fully compensated. This was one of the reasons of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. A little later, in 1784, the Americans built the first ship that successfully sailed to China and returned laden with tea. Since then, China and the US successfully carry on business in different industries. As you understood, wherever tea got, it became demanded and popular. Starting its history in ancient China, tea has become widespread in all corners of the modern world. Wherever you come, almost everywhere you can have a cup of tea, offered by the locals as a sign of hospitality and respect. Studying tea in 2700 BC, Shen Nong most likely had no idea that his discovery would subsequently have such a strong impact on the culture of many people and influence the course of history so much.